All right, so you've sent over some really fascinating research on data in communication and society, and today we're going to dive deep into all of that.
Yeah.
Specifically, how platforms, Google and Facebook especially, are changing how we think about stuff like production and consumption.
Yeah, it's not just about tech anymore, is it? It's about how all this digital stuff's kind of woven into economics.
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things that I saw that you pulled out was how our idea of commodification is being totally upended in the digital age.
I'd never really thought about like likes and comments as commodities before, but
Right.
the more we read about this, the more I'm like, oh, okay, I see it.
It's a huge change, right? Like we used to think about just passively watching TV. Now it's all about our data is being packaged up as valuable, our likes, the time we spend arguing about sourdough bread recipes.
Right.
All of that is valuable, and you highlighted a study that found that a single Facebook user's data could be worth up to $95 a year to the platform.
$95. Wow. Suddenly my like obsession with cat memes feels less like procrastination and more like I have a second job I'm not getting paid for.
Right. And that's the whole thing with this prosumer surveillance problem. Like, we're the consumers, but we're also producing all this data with every click,
Sure.
every share. But we don't really see any of that profit.
Right.
And so it's a pretty good deal for the platforms, but is it a good deal for us? I don't know.
And it's not like we can even really opt out at this point. It would be like trying to like order a pizza without using a phone these days. You know what I mean?
Totally, totally. And that brings us to, the GFAM, the Bante, all that. So Google, Apple, Facebook, or Meta, as they want to be called now,
Right.
Amazon, Microsoft, and then on the other side of the world, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. These aren't just companies anymore. They're like the architects of this new world.
Yeah, it feels very much like they're in this constant battle royale for our attention, for our data, for like our very digital souls, you know?
Yeah.
It's like Westworld or something out there.
Well, that's the whole nature of platform wars, is that it's about network effects.
Mm.
The more users these platforms have, the more powerful they become, which means that there's this winner takes all mentality because the winner gets to set the rules for how it all works.
It's so interesting you should say that because I was thinking about, you highlighted that article about the early days of social media.
Right.
MySpace, Friendster, remember those?
Oh, yeah.
It seems like Facebook basically just came in and ate their lunch. You know what I mean?
Totally. It's a classic example of network effects, right?
Hmm.
Like everyone went to Facebook because that's where their friends were.
Right.
And the cycle just keeps going. But it's not just about your friends anymore, is it?
Right.
I mean, it's about access to information, to jobs, to even political influence.
Okay, so now we're getting a little intense because if we're all kind of stuck in this battle between these platforms, feeding these platforms with our data,
Yeah.
the winner is ultimately the one who gets to write the rules of the future.
Yeah. It's kind of a scary thought. But the good news is that the research that you provided also talks about how we can disrupt this, about democratizing innovation and challenging how we think about ownership.
Okay, now you're talking because that whole winner takes all thing was really bumming me out, not gonna lie.
Yeah.
So, what are these alternatives and do they stand even a little bit of a chance?
Well, to understand that, we kind of have to go a bit deeper into how these platforms work, especially this idea of a platform society.
A platform society, that sounds
A little ominous, right?
intriguing, but also a little bit like a Black Mirror episode.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, platform society. It's giving me chills, but I'm also kind of intrigued. What does that even mean? Is it just a fancy way of saying we're all addicted to the internet?
It's a bit more than that. It's like, think about how you live your life. We order food on platforms, we get rides, we do our banking, we even meet romantic partners on platforms now.
Right.
It's not even just tools anymore. It's like our whole lives are playing out on these platforms. That's kind of the essence of a platform society.
Okay, so how did we get here? Like, was this all some master plan by Mark Zuckerberg or something?
But that's what I find so fascinating about the research you sent. It shows how platforms have evolved from these simple websites to these intricate, complex systems. And like one article you highlighted talked about how Amazon, for example,
Oh,
wasn't always this like everything store.
right,
They started with books,
right.
but then they used all the data they were gathering and how they were designed, the user experience, and they branched out into, well,
Oh.
everything.
Yeah, Amazon's like the ultimate example, which actually makes me think we keep talking about platforms making money, but how? What are they actually selling?
Well, think back to what we were discussing about commodification. Platforms are really good at taking things that used to be free, our attention, how we interact with our friends, our desire to, like, argue with strangers about our favorite cat memes, and they turn it into something they can sell,
So it's true what they say then. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
basically.
Yeah.
You actually highlighted a really interesting study that looked at how platforms use things called dark patterns, like subtle design choices, to nudge us to behave in ways that make more data for them.
So it's like they're manipulating us without us even knowing.
Kind of, yeah. And it's hard to resist because remember, network effects, the more
Yeah.
we use them, the stronger they become. So it's this loop that's really hard to break out of.
You break it, you buy it, right?
Mm.
Although maybe it's more like you use it, you're stuck with it.
Exactly. And that's why these platform wars, like the battle between TikTok and Instagram you mentioned,
Yeah.
it's not just about who's more popular. It's about, like, who gets to decide what our digital lives look like.
Okay, I need a minute to process all this. We've gone from cat memes to manipulation to digital empires in like 5 minutes. Is there any hope? Can we get some control back in this platform society?
That's the question, isn't it? But the research you shared doesn't just talk about the problems, it also highlights potential solutions, like platform cooperatives, data ownership, different ways of governing these technologies.
Okay, now that's what I want to hear. Tell me more. What are these alternatives, and do they actually have a shot against, the big guys? So we've talked about the problems, now for the good stuff. Let's talk solutions. How do we take back some of the power from these big tech companies?
Well, one idea that's getting a lot of attention is this idea of platform cooperatives.
Platform cooperatives, you mentioned that earlier, and I have to say, it seems a little contradictory, right? Platforms are all about big tech companies. How could a cooperative even work in that world?
It's all about shifting who has the power. So imagine a ride-sharing app, something like Uber, but instead of being owned by, like, stockholders and investors, it's actually owned and run by the drivers themselves. So they set the rates, they get to decide what the rules are, and they get to share the profits.
Okay, so it would be like that grocery store in New York you mentioned before. I read that article. It's fascinating. The workers own it, and the shoppers are members, and they all have a say.
Exactly.
But could that really work on, like, a global scale, like these big platforms?
It's already starting to happen. We were talking about data privacy earlier, right?
Right.
There are people working on setting up data cooperatives where users can collectively control their data. They set the rules for how it's used. They could even profit from it if they wanted to.
So instead of being the product, our data is more like we're all shareholders in our own data. I like that.
Yeah.
But realistically, getting people to switch from these huge platforms they already use to some smaller cooperative, it seems like a long shot, doesn't it?
It's definitely a challenge, but that's why it's so important to talk about these things.
Yeah.
You shared that study about how more and more people are worried about the power of big tech.
Right.
That's a good sign. It means people are starting to pay attention, and once people understand the problem, they're much more likely to look for solutions.
So it's all about awareness, showing people there are other ways of doing things.
Exactly. Some researchers think that governments should even step in and support open source platform technologies, so it's easier to set up these kinds of alternatives. Like, imagine if creating a cooperative platform was as easy as setting up a website.
Right. Okay, I'm feeling a little bit better about all this now, but there's one thing we haven't talked about yet, and that's AI. It seems like that's either going to make all these problems worse, or it could be part of the solution. What do you think?
It's tough to say. I mean, AI could definitely make things more unequal, especially if it's only controlled by a few powerful companies. But it could also be a tool to create a more just and equitable society. It all comes down to who has the power to decide how it's used.
It always comes back to power, doesn't it?
It really does. And I think that's why it's so important to be having these conversations, to understand how complex this all is, and to make sure that technology is used to benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Well, we've covered a lot today, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're not just along for the ride when it comes to technology. We actually have choices, and even small actions can make a difference.
I completely agree. Every click, every decision we make online, it all adds up. And the more informed we are, the better choices we can make.
And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up this deep dive. But to our listeners, don't let the conversation end here. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep demands better from the digital world, because ultimately it's our data, it's our lives, it's our future.